Well, I certainly hope that everybody had a really good week and weekend since the last time we got together. I'm sorry that nobody is here tonight. It makes my job a little bit more difficult. I hope that it's not because of anything serious on your guys' part, but we only have a couple weeks for the rest of this term, and I would really appreciate it if whoever can gets on these live calls, because like I said, it does make my job a lot easier, and it helps me to address questions that people have who are taking the class. There are a couple things I want to talk about tonight. The module that we are working on is Post-World War II, Color Field and New Art. And this, I think I mentioned before that one of the things that is kind of interesting about this class is that we are working with, it's called 20th Century Art. We're working with stuff that kind of has set the tonal vocabulary for all the art that we experience now. And I do have this heavily weighted up to about 1980, just because 1980 and forward is in the contemporary art class that I teach. In the last couple weeks, I will try to update that so we are a little bit closer to dealing with the rest of the 20th century. A lot of stuff is going on. I think that you guys have noticed that in the 19th century, most art is still very much realistic and relatable. And then starting about 1880, people start becoming a little bit more creative in their expression. Artists, instead of showing the world how everybody expects to see it, they're showing more and more the world as they see it themselves. And that sets the stage for everything that's come after, where all the artists that operate today, whether or not they're even aware of it, are building on things that people have done before them. And that's just how the world works. And I think it is really important to be able to really appreciate and understand what's going on today, getting a good grasp on the stuff that happened 100 years ago. Another thing that is a little bit of a struggle for me is I am trying to show a relatively broad spectrum of art from around the world as much as I can within the constraints of the class. But when we do the weekly reflections, I want to remind people that the weekly reflections must be on the material that we covered in that module for that week that the weekly reflection is on. Several people have, and this used to happen quite a bit more than it does now, but they would pick whatever they wanted to write the reflection on, and that's not the purpose of the reflection. The purpose of the reflection is twofold. The primary is to demonstrate that you were paying attention to the course material in that module. And I do the weekly reflection rather than a quiz or a test, just because I think it's a little bit more interesting and engaging. But then the other aspect too is so you can demonstrate a facility with the critical thinking model that I use in this class with the 4 steps: describe, analyze, interpret, and evaluate. That critical thinking model, we call it the tools of artistic critique, but it's a critical thinking model. It applies to absolutely everything. Everything that you do moving forward in whatever you do, if you are going to be a horse trainer, or if you are going to be a nuclear physicist, or if you're going to be a custom web designer. It really doesn't, or a nurse, or whatever, fill in the blank. It does not matter. The critical thinking model applies to absolutely everything that you encounter. What I've seen, the only times that people have not followed that model, it's because they either have not read the directions for the weekly reflection, or they sent the wrong assignment. You know, it's most of you are really have a pretty good handle on what's going on. But again, I would remind you that the weekly reflection must be for the material in the module. Now, if you are bringing up something, there's several of you have brought up material that we did not directly cover in the module, but you're able to label it and demonstrate quite clearly that it fits within the module. For example, bringing up other paintings of Cubism that we did not see directly in the module, but it's done, it was, or the material, excuse me, one of the dogs are barking outside, so I have to go get them. But the painting that you picked is by one of the artists that we covered, and it's in the style or the art movement that we covered. And as long as you can articulate that by saying something like, this painting by so-and-so is not one that we covered in the module, but it is a painting, it is done by one of the artists that we talked about. Just a minute. Ayla! Pardon me. Sorry about this. I'm going to mute myself just for a second while I holler her in. The dog is freaking out and she does not want to come in, so we're going to stop that. Sorry for that little intermission. So when somebody sends in a weekly reflection, pardon me, that is not covering the material that was in the module, they won't get any points for it because it doesn't fulfill the requirements. But the grade is coming because it's not fulfilling the requirements of the assignment, not because you're not doing a good job. And so if you do something that you know is linked to the module, and I give you a 0 for it and ask you to identify it, just keep your reflection the way it is, and add at the very beginning how you think it relates to the module. If it is by an artist that we did not cover, but who is recognized as being part of that art movement that is covered in the module, then that definitely counts. But otherwise, it looks like you're doing a great job applying the critiquing model, but it doesn't fit the parameters of the assignment. So you can't get the points. Now, one thing coming up, it is due on April 6th, so that's Sunday, is the final capstone research and discovery project proposal. And I wanted to explain this before we dive into the material that we're covering today, so that you know exactly how this works. And a couple people have already done this, and they did it quite well. And several of you have taken other classes from me as well before and know how to do this, so you don't have a problem. But let me show you this. Let's see. Okay. I am right now. I thought I had keyed up the right page, but I did not. So I'm trying to key that up. Okay, I'm going to share my screen with you and just walk you through the final assignment. And I hope you guys are doing well on the projects. What I've seen has been pretty nice. I think what I'm going to do is, I think next week I'm going to share with you a few of the projects that people have turned in, so you can see what's going on. And I would like everybody to take a moment and um, explore some of the projects that have been turned in the discussion for each of those projects, and tell me what you think. And I would really like you to, for this week, write me, and I'm just saying this in the video, but email me and tell me if you think that it would be uh, appropriate to offer some sort of extra credit for you picking projects that other people have done and applying the 4 tools of artistic critique to them and turning that in as um, something of like, say, a 600 word paper with a couple photos in it of their project, a couple of your screen captures. If that sounds interesting, let me know, and I will make that into an extra credit assignment if I get enough people to let me know that they think it would be a good idea. All right, I'm going to share my screen now so we can talk about this. Okay, so this is the final big assignment that you're going to have. And I would like you to get it done. Well, it needs to be done before finals, if at all possible, especially if you're graduating this year. So I'm going to come down to here. All right, good. Okay. During this semester, instead of doing tests, you're doing projects, and each of the projects are represent 3 to 5 hours of your own work. And what I really appreciate is that for those of you who have turned projects in and didn't quite understand what was going on, when I wrote back and say, well, this needs to have these links back to the uh, course and different things like that, pretty much almost everybody who I wrote things like that to turned right around and reworked their stuff and turned it back in. Like with citations, people took care of that right away and turned that in. Now, there are a few of you who did not get very many points on some of the projects that haven't reworked them and turned them in. Um, please don't let your work go to waste. Look at what the comments that I say. If you're unsure at all, get a hold of me. You can text me. Remember, if you text my cell phone, you need to tell me who you are and which class you're in, and we'll talk. I've done several video calls with people so we can talk through what's going on with their project. And I think one of my favorites was the one about the sandwich that I told everybody about, where by the time they were done with their project, they had been able to demonstrate that this was directly linked to art of ancient Egypt, and the project was spectacular. And that was specifically was for a class that dealt with Egyptian art. So this is line right here is really important for all of your projects. The 6 that you're doing plus the final capstone project is, in order to count for credit, your project must connect with the subject matter of this course. Now remember, the subject matter of this course is 20th century art. That's it. That's the subject of this course. Now, for the final, I say right here, either a research or discovery project to pursue for 10 hours. These are 10 hours. A lot of times in your proposal, you can tell me, okay, I don't think that this is going to take up all 10 hours. And if it doesn't, I want to do this as well. And that is totally cool. It needs to hit 10 hours. And a lot of the times, if you've been doing research and discovery projects and you know how to dial it in right at 4 hours, that's great. But maybe one of the subject, in order to get it to 10, you'll do, for example, an annotated bibliography plus a discovery project where you try to reproduce the style that you're talking about. Or maybe you do an essay plus a PowerPoint. And that's great. You can mix these up however you want. And I'm going to edit this so that it doesn't say either. In fact, let me edit that right now. I'm going to say, or a combination in order to meet the target of 10 hours. Okay, so I just edited that. Because this needs to demonstrate 10 hours of work. And if that means you're going to do a couple small projects on the same subject matter and then a big one, that's great. It needs to be 10 hours and it needs to be all on the same subject. So if you're doing 20th century art and you like Judy Chicago, but you also like Andy Goldsworthy, or I'm sorry, what's his name? The guy that was in Men in Black, Andy, I can't remember. Let's say Yves Klein instead. And you like both of them. For this final capstone project, you can't do one thing on Judy Chicago and one thing on Yves Klein and say that that counts. What you would need to do is a couple of the smaller projects on one or the other, and pick. So you're doing your projects within a specific parameter. And one that I really like, a proposal that I just got that I really, really like, is that the person wants to look at cubism. They want to do 10 hours. And what they proposed is they want to do an in-depth critique of 3 different cubist paintings and perhaps do a PowerPoint associated with that and do a reproduction of a cubist painting. And I think it's brilliant because what they're going to end up doing is keep track of their time. And if it's going to be, that's 3 different smaller projects, but it's all has to do with cubism. And if it looks like their reproduction is going to take a little bit longer than they expect, and they're going to only be able to do either the PowerPoint or an annotated bibliography, they're going to knock one of those out. So they only turn in 2 of the things to keep the entire project under 10 hours. So I hope that makes sense, because if you do an annotated bibliography and a PowerPoint, each of which take 3 to 5 hours, and you do a reproduction cubist painting, which could take maybe 6, then what you got overall as a total is going to be closer to 14 hours. So you're going to have to get rid of one of the projects to bring it down to 10. And that's what this person said that they're going to do. And I'm excited to see what they end up doing. So remember, it's 10 hours. I don't want you to do more than that. But in previous semesters, I have had people turn in what is, because I've been teaching for about 20 years, what I can tell is about a 2.5-hour project and claim that it took 10 hours. As you're doing your project, you do not count overnight drying time for clay and things like that. So that type of stuff does not count. Anyways, if you have any questions, you can get a hold of me. And then I talk about some of the different kinds of things. And if you have any questions, again, ask for clarification. And we will talk about this again next week. Now, your proposal for this is due on Sunday. And as soon as I see these coming in, I will grade them. And this is something that just reiterates, to count for credit, your project must connect with the subject matter of this course. In this module, you'll notice that I have a description of the project that's really lengthy. This is where you actually turn it in. And this talks about exactly what it is and gives you some other project ideas. I'm sorry, that's not where you turn it in. I'll get to that in just a second here. Okay, this is what is really necessary right now. Final capstone project proposal. When I was taking an honors philosophy class years ago, I spent 2 weeks doing a dialectic style discourse for my final project. I forgot to look at, and I completely ignored the parameters of the assignment. And because I turned it in 3 minutes before it was due, the teacher didn't have any time to look at it and tell me I had screwed up. He gave me half points instead of a total 0, which was really kind of him. But I kind of learned a lesson from that. And the lesson is, I don't want you pouring your time into something that just does not count. And especially with something that's this big, it is 10 hours worth of your time, which is not a problem, because if you get started on it right away, do 2 or 3 hours a week, you can have it all done. What you are going to do is tell me at the beginning what your project, what you want to do. Say, I'm going to spend my 10 hours. I want to go to this museum of 20th century art. I'm going to be there with my family anyway. And when you do travel, museum travel, I think you only count like a half an hour of travel time for whatever museum you go to. But if you're going to do that, something like that, I'm going to look at 20th century art, make sure that all the pieces that I look at for this art come from the 20th century. And then I'm going to do I'm going to spend about 2.5 hours with the museum. I'm going to do a bibliography that's going to take me about 4 hours or so. So that gives me 6.5 hours. And then I'm going to do a short PowerPoint where I just talk through what I looked at and share what I learned in my bibliography. And that's going to bring me to the 10 hours. And then I'll say, great. Or you'll say, well, I have no idea what to do. And then I'll email back and I'll say, well, what kinds of things are you good at? And you'll email me and you say, well, I really like music. And then I'll email back and I'll say, well, Wassily Kandinsky heard colors, so maybe that's a good starting point. And then you'll email me back and say, that's great. I think what I'll do then is a research project where I learn about Wassily Kandinsky and then reproduce one of his paintings with markers and make it sure that it gets to 10 hours. Okay, that's great. But so what this email chain that you'll send me is, you'll copy those emails back and forth to nail down your project until you get to your project, what you're going to actually do. And then to get points for this, you're going to turn in that email chain. You're going to turn in the sequence. This is what I first emailed you, all the way down. So at the top is the first email to me, and at the bottom is when I say, great, go ahead. All right. The reason why we need to do this before you do your project is to make sure that you don't spend your time on wasted effort. This project is 20th century art. I don't want you to spend 10 hours working on learning about Baroque paintings when it's not going to count at all. So that's why we've got to do this. And then after that, you can work on the submission of your final capstone project. Okay. And I'm going to show you what this module looks like. So this gives you the guidelines right here as to what you can do. This tells you what you need to turn in for the assignment. Notice both of these are just read. You don't have to turn in anything. This is something that we got at the very beginning of the class. It's just project ideas that people did in the class. And then what your assignment is, the final capstone project proposal. That's what I've just been talking about. And then after that, you'll submit. Notice it's right at the very end of the semester, your final capstone research or discovery project. Now, what is really important too is for those 5 extra points, whole whopping 5 extra points, you're going to share that with the rest of the class. And as we get these turned in, because there's always like 2 or 3 people that turn them in before the April 27th, we're going to get those. We're going to talk about them, see what people have done. Now you notice the other projects you've done are worth 40 points, and this final one is worth 100 points. And then we have to do a class final that has not gone up yet. What I'm going to be doing is on the first day of finals, I will put this up and open it for everybody and email everybody, and you will have, and it is 4 essay questions about your experience in the class. It's not, you can be open book or whatever. It's not going to talk about the art that we looked at. It's going to talk about what your experience is in this class. And that's what the class final is. So I'm going to open that up. You're going to answer the questions and submit them with the final. And it's going to be open every day of finals. So you can take it anytime during finals. Now, what's important about this, the absolute final assignment, is that if you don't get it, there's enough points associated with it that it will drop you a whole grade if you don't bother turning it in. But the good thing is, if you turn it in early at the beginning of finals week and you don't get all the points you want, you can correct it and resubmit it up until the last moment of finals. Okay, so that's something to, I think that's important to remember. So I hope that has helped. If not, I don't know what to tell you. I'm doing the best I can. And what we will, if you do have any questions about any of the stuff that I talked about this thing, talk to me between now and Tuesday, and I will address those questions in the recorded lecture for class. I'm really hoping that makes sense to everybody. I'm trying to make this as clear as possible. I don't like doing tests and quizzes myself, and that's one of the reasons why the assessment model that we use in this class is reflection and project-based, as opposed to quiz and test-based. And it's interesting to me because everybody who's taken classes from me with this model have come out feeling like they have understood or are more engaged with the subject matter, which is really nice to hear. But if you do have any questions, please let me know. Now, again, the proposal is due on Sunday. If you don't get it done by Sunday, before Sunday, at the very least by Sunday, email me initially, either by telling me I have no idea what to do, or give me your initial idea. So email me, and then when you turn that assignment in, you copy and paste the emails, and you turn that document in. So you're turning in a copy of the emails. All right. What we are talking about right now is color field and the new art. That is, so I'm shifting rather cold from talking about projects and stuff like that we have coming up at the end of the term to what the module is, the material on the module for today. We are coming to the close of our semester together, and this work, a lot of this art that we're looking at it's post-war, primarily post-World War II. So we're talking 1950s and forward. but this covers a span from about mid 1940s all the way to about 1970s, right through there. And what's interesting is that most of the stuff that we're looking at, it still feels very fresh and very modern. The modern, I think I've told you before, I have OCD, and it frustrates me that there isn't a date for when art movements begin and end. We have 3 different dates that sound like they should all mean the same thing, but they don't all mean the same thing. Not 3 different dates, 3 different terms. And those terms are modern, postmodern, and contemporary. Now, modern, I'm sorry, I'm going to mute this for just a second. Somebody just came to the door, and I'm the only one here. So give me just a second. Somebody was really sweet and just delivered a present for my wife because people like her more than they like me. But that is fine. I don't get hurt. Or little things like being socially approved. Okay. And then the dog got tired of barking outside and she came in. Okay, so I'm talking about these terms sound like they should be synonyms for each other. Modern, postmodern, and contemporary. They're really not. And what you'll find, and which you probably have already discovered because most of you have already taken several art history classes anyway, what you'll find is that these 3 terms, a lot of the times in art history, when people are talking about art history, a lot of the times, terms that sound like they should mean the same thing don't. Like we have period and movement, and we talked about why those are different. Remember, art periods are generally very expansive. They deal with cultures and they deal with large geographical areas, or small, but they deal with confines of geographical areas. And art movements are usually a lot shorter because they're reacting to the culture. They're not part and parcel of the culture, but they're reacting or responding to the culture somehow, and or critiquing the culture. And they generally will last a very short amount of time. So even though movement and period sound like they should mean the same, they don't. And that's the same as modern, postmodern, and contemporary. Modern means pretty much, and again, this doesn't have specific dates as to when it begins and ends, but it pretty much fits within about 1860, 1850, 1860 to about 1950, right around there. Postmodern generally is about 1950 and forward to about 1980. And contemporary is generally about 1980 and forward. Now, they do overlap quite a bit. There is some contemporary work that is still considered to be very contemporary that is done earlier than that. And a lot of the times people won't even look at stuff before 1990, considering it contemporary. Postmodern and modern do seem to overlap quite a bit because modern, even though the cutoff may be around 1950 or so, it seems to float forward up to maybe about 1970 in some areas. And postmodern, even though the cutoff is about 50, it really had its roots begun right about 1920. That's when it started. I'm not going to say that's when it started. I'm going to say it looks like that's when people started fiddling with what became postmodern. Now, the difference of modern and postmodern is not necessarily, is partly the time periods. Again, modern 1850, 1950, postmodern 1950, 1980, 1990, right around there. What the biggest difference between those two is that modern tried to express or communicate using either new visual cues or um, visual cues that people just hadn't ever used in that way before. This is where we start seeing abstraction appear. So people are still trying very much to communicate. A lot of the times there's a story or they're communicating an emotion or an idea, but there's still something of content or message to it. And postmodern is more of an exploration of uh, perhaps textures and materials. And it's trying things that are new without necessarily paying a whole lot of attention to trying to communicate something. Or if there is any attempt at communication, it's communication that is incredibly difficult to nail down. You don't see in a postmodern thing the important in a postmodern work, the important thing is not going to be that you can see a child playing with a toy, as or anything else that you can identify. The important thing is going to be that the artist really likes using cement, and that's it. Modern, on the other hand, the earlier thing, that's from 1850 to 1950 ish. Modern would be abstracting the idea of a boy or a child playing with a toy. And when we look at some of these artists, we're right on the edge of dealing of that transition from modern to postmodern, where we're going where artists are kind of stepping away from story ideas and just enjoying material usage, and trying to communicate really numinous things that don't have necessarily direct attachment to ideas we can identify, like emotions, for example. They're more exploring the materials. And the reason why this is good to think about as we go into these artists that we're looking at this week is consider what the artists are trying to do. Do you think they're trying to communicate? Do you think they're enjoying the materials themselves? Or do you think that they're enjoying the use of the materials and the communication or the ideas that they're sharing are either secondary or really, really difficult to get your finger on? And if that is all kind of confusing, then that's pretty much how it is. Because the ideas of the separation between modernism and postmodernism is something that art historians, you get two different art historians in a room and ask them that question, and you're going to get four different opinions. And it's just because it is difficult to nail down. And what I gave you is just basically the general guidelines. And again, contemporary art is a bit of a different animal. We're talking about 1980, 1990 to today. And contemporary art seems to fuse those two ideas, using materials in with new visual vocabulary to express ideas, and then using materials because they're fun to work with and not worrying about communicating. It seems like contemporary art fuses those together. So, which is really kind of an interesting thing. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we're going to go back. I want you to read all this and watch these videos. We're talking about European history and the recovery process after World War II. World War II, the Depression was bad when a lot of countries decided getting into war with each other was going to be a way out of the Depression. Whenever extreme violence is seen to be the thing that rescues you from the worst situation, the situation it rescues you from has got to be pretty bad. And what we're looking at is some really interesting reactions to World War II and coming out after World War II. And I want to, this is about a 5-minute a short 5-minute video about art after World War II. And these two videos right here talk about consequences of World War II and what's going on. Because you do get a growth of unprecedented economic ability after World War II for several countries. Other countries like in Great Britain, even though there was a lot of hope, there was still a lot of rationing for quite a while after World War II. Countries like Germany and Japan, for example, were beaten down pretty hard during World War II. But afterwards, there was something called the Marshall Plan that the U.S. spearheaded, which was designed to get them back on their feet economically as rapidly as possible. So we would turn them in, I'm saying we, so that the United States and other allied powers would turn Japan and Germany into allies as well. And so you see a lot of really interesting things happening. So we're going to watch this video really quick. Okay. And if I remember right, I hope it's a pretty good one. Let's see, it's only 4.5 minutes, or almost 5 minutes long.
Everything in art and art history would change forever. The steady path of growth and change in art would now take a dark turn. This turn to eventually lead into what we know now as postmodern or contemporary art, which never would have happened without the power shift that occurred in the world at the end of the war. To note something, the reason why art is so important to look at is that it's a representation of a broader culture and the ideas that people want to put forth or make statements about. By looking at art, we can understand more about what's happening in a certain country or group of people. Anyway, back to our discussion of World War II. It's April 1945. The Soviets ransacked Berlin. The Nazis lost. The US came in and liberated the camps. Of course, during the war, the US President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the UK leader Churchill knew about the camps. There were murmurs of what they were like, but once the war ended and the prisoners freed, the rumors about the camps spread like wildfire. What was the death toll? What were the conditions like? With the Nazis all either dead, on trial, or somewhere between Germany and Argentina, they had no say in the public eye what the camps were like. So naturally, the Jews that survived told their story, and their story spread. Soon, everyone knew what had happened. This brings us to Theodor Adorno, whose words would shift the direction of art immensely through his writings, particularly those on German culture. Theodor W. Adorno, born in Frankfurt as Theodor Ludwig Weissengrund. His mother had the name Adorno. She was a Catholic from Corsica. His father was an assimilated Jew who converted to Protestantism. When Theodor applied for U.S. citizenship, his name was changed to Theodor W. Adorno. Very influential as a German philosopher, he wrote in 1949 that, quote, "To write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric." He asks his readers what German culture could really be after the Holocaust. His idea was that art or poetry was beautiful and created to evoke feelings, yet the only emotion they should feel is that of sadness, despair, depression, defeat, etc. He wrote in his essay Commitment about the artist's paradox, where they wanted to create art but knew it would be wrong to do so. They couldn't create art that was about the terrible things that happened because the viewers would never understand the pain and suffering, and instead, they'd actually enjoy looking at the art. He questioned if art had the right to exist anymore due to the regression of society. He said that those who hate this new art are hateful of social realism and that they have, quote, moral terror, partly because the acts committed by the Nazis were done on a moral high ground. He advocated for new artworks that are socio-political in nature because politics had now become a part of everyday life. Art must be political. He went on to become director of the Institute for Social Research, which researched sociology and philosophy and would develop critical theory and help in the development of the Frankfurt School. which was a social theory school that enrolled neo-Marxists who were uncomfortable with capitalist, fascist, and even communist systems. They wrote about new developments influenced by none other than Karl Marx. Art informel was an umbrella term for the various art movements in Europe during and after World War II. It was a very personal style that was created to help remedy the past and cope with post-war life. The European continent was destroyed after the war, and artists were dealing with trauma and violence. This movement was a pushback of people rejecting Western heritage due to the horror of the war, and they rejected beauty as well. Most of these images were meant to look like human bodies, blood, bullet holes, wounds, and overall destruction. This art was so different than anything before. They wanted people to feel the pain of the war and understand it. Art informel was all about formless art and pushing people to feel these emotions. As where previous art movements had been structured, this one was all over the place, lacking structure and form. This is exactly what it would end up doing to European art, as artists who wanted to create something beautiful instead were forced to focus on the trauma of the atrocities of the war and dwell on the Holocaust forever. Art would forever change after the war, and what was once considered high art would be manipulated and shifted to fit a political agenda.
Okay, so we're talking about a pretty dark view of art after this. And it's interesting that this individual that the narrator talked about was one point of view. Another point of view was a guy named Viktor Frankl, who was a psychologist who survived World War II in an internment camp. He was in one of these. He was a Jew in Europe, and he was in one of the horrible Holocaust camps and managed to survive the war. And one of the things he said was, and his last name is Frankl. One of the things he said was, when human beings decide, to survive, they survive. And he said you could take two different people, and he observed this firsthand because he was in one of these concentration camps. I think he had been moved around. He'd actually, by the end of the war, he'd actually been through three of them, I think. But he said that you take two people that are the same age, or both fathers, both have children that have been separated from them and they don't know if they'll ever see them again. Both carpenters, from their villages in Germany. But he said that one person would grow, and they would both be in the same internment camp doing the same things with the same people in the same horrible situation. But one person would be filled with hatred and be angry with their lot, and the other one would look for things to laugh about and find humor and use their energy to help support other people. And he said that it was interesting because that showed to him that human beings could endure anything if they decided they were going to. And they may be killed, but the human being doesn't have to allow their situation to determine how they feel about it. And he said a lot of other really, really interesting things, but from a lot of the things that he was writing, it reminds me of a lot of those Harlem Renaissance artists that we were, and writers and workers that we were looking at, where they really kind of celebrated the idea of self-determinism, that regardless of the circumstances, you can decide how to react to them. And you can see how that would be at odds with the German expressionist negativity that was so preponderant after, or supported by that individual after World War II. And what is interesting to me is Ralph Waldo Emerson is one of the writers who is responsible for really propagating an idea that what you give energy to grows. And this is something that you've noticed in your own life. When you focus on something, that thing that you're focusing on becomes bigger and bigger until it's all that you can see. And there's a couple videos on YouTube of people sliding down a hill and hitting the only tree for miles, things like that. And um, the things that I thought those were silly until somebody pointed out that the person is concentrating so much on avoiding the tree that that's the only thing that they aim for. And which I think is interesting. I think it ties in to what we're talking about. Um, it it can be very therapeutic when you are dealing with severe trauma to continue to revisit the trauma in a healthy environment and work through it. That is one really solid way that has been shown for a lot of people who respond to it appropriately to deal with trauma. But I think we all have met people or have people in our families where the individual does not respond to a healthy environment and allows that trauma to become so much a part of their world that they can't see past it. And what's interesting to me is people like Viktor Frankl were saying that, yes, there is the trauma. They're not denying that. But what they are saying is how you choose to respond to the trauma is entirely up to you. And ultimately, it's healthier when you look for a way to move past it, to heal from it. Try to heal. Like if you cut yourself, you take care of the cut and wash it and keep it clean, it's going to heal better than if you keep picking at it, which is kind of a gross uh, image, but it does seem to be true. So this is the kind of world that we're looking at, and like we talked about last week, we're talking about a lot of these artists that we looked at are dealing with or struggling with um, ideas of um, constant Cold War and nuclear holocaust um, threat constantly. And we're talking end of World War II as well. Last week we were talking a lot about these guys are in um, the Americas, but now we're talking about um, European stuff. And one of the big differences, I think, is Europe is where a lot of the fighting was. And so artists there are going to have greater difficulty accessing workspaces and resources for their art when it is a difficult thing just remaining alive as opposed to what people are doing in the US. And so we're talking about some of these uh, things as well. And it is overlapping a little bit of what we were talking about last week. And I wanted to, we may or may not look at this. It just depends on how long this is. Let me see how long it is. Okay, this is about 5 minutes. Um, okay, the new sculpture movement one is about a half an hour. You don't need to watch that one. It would be nice if you played it in the background so you learn about it. But what we're talking about is new art, new sculpture. Just this is this kind of idea. Um, sorry, this element of the module is just to introduce you to that. So this is a 5-minute video. This is a 32-minute video, again, played in the background if you want to play it. And then this one, let's see how long this one is. This is about 13 minutes. This individual is talking about women artists in the war. And what I want to do is um, we're not going to watch this whole thing necessarily, but I do want to show you some of the works. So these are works that are done by women artists post World War II. And the thing that is interesting to me that I want you to be mindful of is look at the brushwork and look at some of the artwork that people are doing. And maybe we are overlaying our own emotional expectations on these things, but some of them do seem kind of dark. Some of them do seem kind of harsh, but others of them do seem like they're constructing something new, and they seem kind of hopeful. So um, do take the time to look at through this video. It is 13 minutes, but there's some beautiful artworks in this. This reminds me of the one of the ones we saw earlier, where we talked about how to see the art, how to follow things around. A lot of color and expression. This one to me seems a little bit more hopeful than this earlier one right there. And then he's harkening back. He's just talking about some of the things that Van Gogh did in relationship to what he's seeing with these other artists. And this is one of my very favorite artists. I believe her name is Louise Nevelson, and very much post-war. And she's what she did was she would go on walks, and she knew about a furniture plant that was near her apartment in New York. And what she would do is go to this furniture plant and just find all the furniture garbage she could. And these are cut off pieces where part of them is broken or they're just left over in the trash heap or whatever. And what she would do is make these little boxes. And you can see one of them right here where she would just put the pieces in the box and paint everything black, gray, different shades of gray, sometimes white. And if she did one of those, that would be really kind of interesting. But what's interesting is, or really fantastic, 5 high, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So she's made 40 of these little vignettes and put them together into something that now becomes pretty spectacular. This thing is almost 8 feet tall and 10 feet wide. A little is good, more is better. And when it comes to art, a whole lot sometimes is a whole lot. It becomes, this is of a scale and a size where it feels important. And what's interesting is that it's all the exact same color. And she's using basically garbage, spray painting it all, or painting it all the same color. So it looks like it's consistent. And all that garbage now becomes something really interesting. Now, I don't know if this is intended to be a monument to something. I don't think it is, but I hope you can start seeing where people are starting to make that separation between modern art and postmodern art. Modern art is a painting that is an abstraction of something you might see out the window. Postmodern would be where the artist is having fun working with a material or textures, and they're not that interested in communicating a message. What this piece one of the things that makes this piece so interesting to me is I don't think that she's trying to communicate anything specific. That's not, I don't think that that's the point. I think what the point is, she is taking really interesting shapes and putting them together. You come to this, it doesn't matter what language you speak or what stories you know, you're going to find something that attracts your eye. And it doesn't attract your eye because it has a bright color or it's moving. It attracts your eye because it's a pleasing texture. And things like this sometimes are also called textural poems, where the idea is not at all to communicate anything specifically, but it's to engage your eyes and to engage your imagination as you imagine what those textures feel like. And maybe you find points of reference that remind you of things. Like some of these remind me of banisters in my friend Raj's house growing up. This reminds me of one of the chairs in my grandma's dining room. This reminds me of another chair, this time in an art studio in Utah County. And then she also has different layers of these things. So we find texture that's behind other texture. But if you compare this to an abstract painting, like a cubist painting, difference is a cubist painting, the person is making something that is based in reality. And in this particular piece, it's not based in reality. It's not intended to be. It uses real objects, but it is more or less a celebration of texture. and material. It's not intended to have what art historians might call content. Now, we are going to be talking a little bit about color field. We mentioned Mark Rothko last week and Helen Frankenthaler, Barnett Newman, all these people. These guys fit into this idea. Yes, it is abstract expressionism, but these guys were also what are called color field painters. And I want you to look at these things from that perspective. So, again, we have some more Mark Rothko and things like that. And one of the reasons why I want to do this is the same artist doing the exact same paintings can fit into several different art movements because of how they're doing it. And and this really sets the stage when we move into ideas like conceptual art. Now I want to, let's see, how long is this? Okay, these are good. I want to watch both of these, and I'll give you a pretty good idea of what color field painting is. I don't think we're going to go through these. I want you to look at these, check these out and look at the videos. I think I try to get them all about 4 or 5 minutes, but definitely look at the links there. And what's interesting to me about these is Morris Louis was doing something that looks like it could be postmodern because it doesn't look like it has a lot of content. But for him, these passages of color represented veils from understanding. And Bart Newman, the zips that he made in his color field paintings represented for him the moment of inspiration. So it does look like it could be postmodern, but it does have a little bit of meaning in it too. So I want you to think about that as well. So I'm going to go ahead and we're going to watch these.
So now we're dealing with the second half of abstract expressionism. We are dealing with chromatic abstraction. And chromatic abstraction is getting at the same ideas of abstract expressionism, trying to pull emotion out of the viewer, but doing it in a different way. We want to remove any kind of symbolism and focus purely on really sort of the power of color. So how do we define this? The term color field painting refers to a particular style of American abstract expressionism associated with the New York School of Modern Art. It tends to be characterized by large, flat fields of solid color, which envelops the spectator when seen at close quarters. It deliberately avoided the use of forms standing out against the background. Instead, form and background and ground are one, and the picture, seen as a field rather than a window, draws the eye towards the edges of the canvas. Now, seen as a field as opposed to a window, traditional painting is a window into an illusion, into a three-dimensional world. Think of the Mona Lisa, for example. Whereas a field is under no pretension to draw you into any kind of three-dimensionality. It is unapologetically two-dimensional, and therefore becomes a field rather than the illusion of three-dimensional space, which we're used to. So the style was designed to have emotional impact.
Okay. So that's the definition. And then this one, sorry, I hit the wrong button. Let me get back to this. Okay, here we go. And this is some of the ideas associated with color field painting.
In terms of ideas, color field painting emerges out of the attempts of several artists in the late 1940s to devise a modern, again, mythical art, this idea that we had from abstract expressionism as well. Seeking to connect with the primordial emotions locked in ancient myths. Rather than the symbols themselves, they sought a new style that would do away with any suggestion or illustration. The style will be championed most enthusiastically again by Clement Greenberg, who bemoaned what he saw as increasingly imitative academic qualities of some action painters. He argued that color field painting represented the way forward. Now, color field painting marks a major development in abstract painting, since it was the first style to resolutely avoid the suggestion of any form or mass or anything else standing out against a background. Instead, figure and ground are one, and the space of the picture, conceived as a field, seems to spread out beyond the edges of the canvas, as if the canvas is a snapshot. Imagine that I'm out in, say, the Netherlands, where there are giant fields of tulips, and I'm trying to take pictures from an airplane of these fields. And obviously, I can't capture everything I see, but I can capture parts of it. And that's the illusion that we get from color field, that we're only seeing a piece of what's there as opposed to seeing the whole, which is what we're used to in more traditional forms.
Okay, so with color field painting, people are trying to make something that consciously avoids any connection to meaning. So I would say, when we talk about the difference between postmodern and modern, it sounds like that's what these guys are doing. Now, I look at color field painting as meditations, and they're designed to kind of empty your mind so that you can get to a safer space emotionally to deal with that constant threat of a nuclear annihilation or Cold War type stuff, because that's what this grew out of. And color field seems to be more of a Zen approach to that. Now, what's interesting to me is color field painting is an aspect of abstract expressionism that seems to tie in to what Viktor Frankl said about that you can choose your own way. You don't have to live within the trauma. You can choose a way to healthily address that and move forward. That's what I think. I don't know what. Think about that and see how you feel about it. I just think that that's really interesting. So the next person, or the next type of thing that we're going to be talking about, is the new sculpture. Now, a new sculpture, we're still dealing, a lot of this is going to be abstract. Alberto Giacometti is very abstract. You remember, if we were talking about, there's different kinds of abstract. Generally, you're going to have abstract in one corner and and that's generally going to be an abstraction of what you might exist in the real world. And then you're going to have non-objective abstract or non-objective art. And non-objective means it's abstract that doesn't have a base in the actual world. And Anthony Caro is a really good example of the non-objective, and Alberto Giacometti is a really good example of just a straightforward abstract. And we are talking about Europeans, European work. And what is interesting to me about this is the bodies, the forms have a lot of texture to them. And we saw that a little bit. Let's see if I can. I've clicked on this, the Hepworth Wakefield collection. It's post-war British sculpture and painting. And I want to share this with you so you can see some of these things that are going on. Now, some of these are going to be traditional abstracts, like we've got what looks like a shark here, maybe. We have several people. But others of them are going to be things that are just way out there. They don't have a direct relationship to anything in the world. And so they are going to be non-objective. And what's interesting about this is you'll see some people have an idea that, like Viktor Frankl, where they are in charge of their own reactions to the world, and others feel like it's kind of harsh and edgy and uncomfortable to look at, which I think is really interesting. A lot of these post-war British sculptors, though, went with ideas of that seem to be associated in my mind with healing. Like, I think that this is absolutely beautiful. I think that this is Barbara Hepworth, and it does for me something very similar as when we look at a Mark Rothko meditative painting. It looks to me like this is almost a meditation. And it's a meditation where the person is trying specifically to move past trauma and emotional horror, and move towards a safer and healthier place. And this feels like a meditative healing type of work to me, and I think that's really interesting. And as we look at some of these others, I want you to watch these videos as well. Anthony Carroll, a lot of his artwork, this is not intended to be abstract as if it's dealing with real world issues. It feels to me like this person is exploring very much ideas of material and abstraction of ideas, more non-objective. This feels to me like a revisiting of some of that stuff that we saw with the Russian constructivism. This feels very much like it. This feels very abstract, but it feels abstract from the standpoint of non-objective, where it's not intended to be an object that you would actually see, where he's distorted it and made it simpler. And it just really interesting. They also seem to feel like explorations of texture and material. Doesn't seem to necessarily need to have any sort of a story behind it. Like this little piece here, I think is really interesting. And these sculptural works, again, they feel like they're explorations of material. And I look at something like this, and I still feel that it has a more of a positive perspective. Now, we're not looking at a lot of the German expressionists, and one of the reasons is because they are very depressing a lot of the times. And I will want to show you, this is another post-World War II artist, and Eduardo Chillida. And what I love about his work is there's no mistaking that these are not intended to be reflections on the real world. These are non-objective, very much non-objective. But what's fascinating to me is Eduardo loves the material he's working with. And it feels like this is that material. This is made out of mild steel, so it's rusting, but it feels like it's becoming what it's always wanted to be, where the material is listened to and it behaves the way it wants to. It's not being used to follow what the artist wants. I don't know if that makes sense, but this, I think, is very much in that postmodern realm because it's all about the material and what the material feels, what feels right for the material. And I think that some of these are very beautiful. So we talked about, I'm sorry, I lost my place. Give me just a second here. So we look at a lot of the post-war European art, and I think you're going to see some really interesting things as people revisit similar ideas to what we've already seen. But this is from like I said, the European perspective. And I do have a couple of the German expressionists in here. Not very many, again, because I find that art to be really depressing, so I don't want to burden you with it. But what's fascinating to me is that Jean de Buffet does a lot of stuff very much like Jackson Pollock, his contemporary in New York. And when he does it, he's French, and he does it from his French perspective. And so a lot of this stuff, I think, shows some of that negativity and harshness dealing with trauma like was spoken about in the video. And you can see, you know, this one of his paintings was even used in the video. And you look at these things, this is done at about the same time as some of the color field stuff that we were looking at. Excuse me. But it feels very different, doesn't it? I mean, it feels very different. It doesn't feel, you know, this one I think is pretty happy, but it feels like he is working through some pretty harsh stuff. Now, I do not think that this is less valid because he's dealing with harsher stuff. And some of this stuff, it looks to me like he's in a happier spot, or at least a much healthier spot. What's interesting, though, is that I think you can tell because of the colors, because of the textures, the visual textures used, because of the shapes and lines that the artists are using, it gives you a very different feeling, doesn't it? And I think that's an important thing to be able to see and identify. Now, Alberto Giacometti, I really love the stuff that he does, because he's one of these people. He's in Italy, and what is interesting to me is he created stuff that could have been, like some of his contemporaries, could have been a lot more negative, but he chose not to. And I think his stuff, it's ethereal. It's absolutely beautiful. And what is fascinating to me, you know, look at these objects. This is somebody who does enjoy their material, but I feel that it's abstracted. It's abstracted realism because we can tell that these are human figures. That's what he's working with. But what is interesting to me is I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where you've been driving on a hot day and you look and just far enough away that you can't tell any detail. You just tell it's an individual there, and that individual is just far enough out of focus that you only see them because the light is coming around them, and they kind of fade into almost ghosts. You know, you're not quite even sure that they're there. That's how it feels to me Giacometti did his sculptures. It feels to me that yes, we can walk around them, we can hold them, but they feel like they're people just on the edge of the horizon, which I think is really interesting considering that the time period that he's working in, you know, post World War II, people are recovering, people are dealing with the trauma and sometimes hatred and anger. And it's fascinating to me that the texture makes me think of those harsh things that we've seen in other artwork, but the forms themselves feel kind of imposing, almost shadowy, but they also feel kind of elegant. And so I can, it feels to me like this individual is working with trauma, but it doesn't feel like it's a trauma that's taking over their life. And I just think that that's really fascinating. Again, I don't know if you agree with me or not. I would love to hear. And look at each of these artists. They're dealing with some very interesting things that are quite a bit different than some of the other stuff that we've seen. Now, Yves Klein is one of my favorite artists. And one of the reasons for that is he was one of the first artists to copyright a color. It was Klein Blue. But one of the things that he did is work with human beings and art in such a way that was not necessarily intended to be his abstraction, but you kind of make the abstraction with your mind. And he is doing things that look like they're exploitative, but they're calling attention to somebody. And remember, right after World War II, that is when women started being heavily targeted from specifically cosmetic companies. Women being constantly told that they weren't pretty enough and only makeup could fix it. And I have several daughters. Let's see, 1, 2, 3. I have 7 daughters, And this is something that bothers me as a parent, that they are remarkable. They are incredibly remarkable individuals, but they're being targeted uh, still today as subjects for marketing campaigns, being reminded that they can't be attractive without plastering themselves with rendered sheep fat. And one of the things that Yves Klein did was take things like that, and this Untitled was a project where he said the premise is essentially, okay, if you are going to see women as targets for marketing, essentially you're dehumanizing them. I'm going to show you what that looks like all the way. So he turned the women into paintbrushes, and that's what this is. And so now um, there is kind of a narrative communicated in this. It is about an exploration of the medium, but the medium is being used, and the process is being used to call attention to something that is political. Which, so we're dealing with several different ideas that tie in to both um, uh, Viktor Frankl and that art must all be political in post World War II. So I think that that's really interesting. And then, of course, this is the blue that he developed and had copyrighted. Now, this Johannes Schreider is, I hope you understand why I like him so much, but he was one of these German post-war people. You know, he was a teenager at the end of the war, and so he's dealing a lot with that horrible trauma that so many of his contemporaries are dealing with. But what he did is he's using glass as a medium, and he's making these things that I think we can see they have relation to that expressionism that deals with harsh lines, as well as that kind of attitude of expressionism that deals with color field painting. So broad swaths of color, and he does with the stained glass medium. It can be really unexpected. He was a master of his craft because he's doing things that are not supposed to be physically possible with glass, yet he's figured out a way to make us believe he's done them anyway. He uses these lead lines. These look like paintings. They're very painterly. They have this really beautiful quality about them. And I think that he does something very much like what Viktor Frankl is talking about, taking charge of how he's responding to a horrible situation. He's dealing with it rather meditatively. And what is beautiful to me is that these feel like, if almost like Christian, Zen Christian meditations. And a lot of these are in churches and libraries where people are supposed to be calm. And I just think that these are absolutely fantastic. Let's see how long this video is really quick, because I think, okay, this is 16 minutes. We're not going to watch the whole thing. I'm going to wind up pretty quick, but I want to show you some of the paintings and glasswork that Johannes Schreider did. And a lot of these are going to be paintings on glass. And some of these are gigantic. Like this particular piece is, each of these squares is about, I believe, 3 by 3. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 12. So this is 20 feet high and about 30 feet wide. And it looks like it's a painting, but this is an expressionist glass piece. And he's just exploring color. And what's fascinating to me too, we talk about some of these things where people are celebrating the material. Now this is part of a church. This is a church sanctuary. And what's fascinating to me is this feels to me that it is very postmodern in that it's a celebration of material, but it also feels like it's designed specifically to evoke emotion. So it is postmodern expressionist work, and I think it's really fascinating. This is one of his pieces. I believe this is the Four Gospels. And I hope you can see that there does feel to be a lot of similarity with Mark Rothko. And I think you can see that, particularly this piece right here, which of course, only homage to Mark Rothko. And it's fascinating to me to see what these different pieces do, playing with different textures, playing with different ideas, with just using the glass. And I think it's absolutely fascinating. But again, it feels to me like some of these are a little bit political because of where they're placed, where they're inviting people to embrace the idea of healing in some of the most from some of the most horrible places. This is from Psalm 124, where it's a reference to living through the Holocaust. And it becomes very interesting to me that this feels meditative. But it also feels very powerfully emotional. Again, this piece is about 18 feet tall. I believe this piece is about 8 feet tall. So some of these are quite large. And so look at some of these. This is from a library. And it's just really fascinating to me how he is combining so many of the ideas that we're talking about in post-World War II. We're talking about emotive work that can be healing or political, or kind of be a conversation with the artist as they're lost within the trauma. It can be, and a lot of these feel very much like the person is self-determining. They like Viktor Frankl said, they are deciding how they are going to be reacting and responding to the world. These are some more from that same library, and here it's the titles under each of them. This was a bombed out church where the church structure itself stood, but it was rebuilt as a library. And when he was asked to make these windows, he was trying to bring in all the associations that church represented, tied in with the war, tied in with post-war development, tied in with all those kinds of things, and also trying to bring it to mind to people that this may no longer be a church in the traditional sense, but it was still a sanctuary for learning and positivity and moving forward and healing. And I think some really amazing things. And these do feel very postmodern to me. They're abstract in the sense that they're not objectively abstract in this, because they don't have a direct relation to any real world element. And some of these are continuing that tradition. Some of these I think are from the 80s and maybe even early 90s, but they still feel very much like that stuff that he did in the 60s and late 50s. Very interesting stuff. So as you do your reflection for this week, I want you to think about these artists. Find one that seems to be processing this post-World War II type thing. The idea, not that specifically necessary, but try to find one of these artists that are processing this kind of trauma, this cultural trauma, in a way that either is interesting to you or you can really connect with. And think about that and see what you have to say about that. And you'll do your description like you normally do and your analysis. But as you go switch into your interpretation and evaluation, really think about what how are you responding to this person as you see them resonating with your situation or how you feel about it? And it may be that you agree with them or not. That uh, either way, as long as you pick an artist and artwork that you feel some sort of visceral response to, I think it'll work out really well. So this week's we're kind of shifting gears a little bit and thinking about this from a perspective more, I guess, of philosophy and worldview, and which ties us into as we move forward, we're going to look at a couple other things that tie us into the idea of conceptual art. So, we've looked at paintings, a lot of paintings. We were looking at collages. If you remember, right around World War I, we were looking at collages. We're looking at painting and furniture. And I'm not talking about canvas painting, more like painting as a visual element of architecture, perhaps, maybe. We're looking at material use. We looked at architecture as all those as art medium. And then, and even stained glass and costuming with the Bauhaus and things like that. With Johannes Schrader, we started looking at stained glass. So we're looking at a wide range of media that different artists worked in. And, but artists have been using the medium and presenting that as the object of art. And right about this time, this is when we start getting into artists that are using the medium as the tool, and the actual object of art is your thoughts about it, how you are responding to it. That is what they're trying to sculpt, and that's called conceptual art. I think that's what we're going to be getting into next week. So I'm going to be switching the module. If you are one of the people that are jumping ahead of the game and doing weekly reflections before I have a chance to change the module around, that's fine. It will still count. And if you turn it in before I switch the module and I grade it incorrectly, please just remind me. So far, I haven't changed any of the modules, but I'm going to be doing that over the next week or two so that we get a broader spectrum of stuff for the end of the semester. So we talked about your final project, and the next part of that, or the first part of that that's due, is your proposal. And your proposal is, we talked about that, it's going to be essentially you're submitting to me your copies of the emails that we have back and forth where you talk about what your project is, and with the last email being from me saying, great, go for it. And sometimes that'll be, maybe your first proposal is going to be perfect, but most of the time it's going to be, I'll ask you to either tone it down a little bit or bring it into the subject matter, or invite you to do a couple of smaller projects to help make up the 10-hour thing, like with the example that I shared. And then we talked about artwork specifically from the perspective of post-World War II. And this primarily European. So we were talking about work that is basically going on in Europe at the same time as what we saw last week was going on here in the Americas, and the US and Mexico. So jumping around just a little bit. But if you have any questions about the final project stuff or anything like that, please let me know. And also, please go through, make sure you submitted all your attendance assignments, and go through and look at any assignments that I've given partial points for. Do what you need to fix it so you can get the full points. There's no reason for anybody not to get an A in this class. You can do it. Just resubmit and fix things until you get a perfect score. All right. I look forward to seeing everybody next week, and I hope you have a wonderful and safe week and weekend, and I look forward to seeing projects as they get done. Thank you very much. We'll see you guys.